Welcome, everybody, to the Success Elevated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Hayden Lee, and I am joined this week by a very special guest. He graciously agreed to join kind of last minute this week, so we really, really appreciate him. Kameron Hensley, CEO and co-founder of One Tom Plumber. Kameron, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the intro.
You've got the great background, much better than mine currently is. You've got the shirt, the One Tom Plumber logo in the background. You even have a pink drink in the background. I mean, you went
So,
all aboard for the One Tom Plumber promo today.
oh, well, that's every day. So it's actually a cup that is pink, so that it makes whatever you're
Oh,
drinking look pink.
it
Um,
looks like you were okay. Gotcha. Very cool.
yeah, I've got some water right here, and everyone thinks I'm drinking Kool-Aid.
You were drinking
So
some
something
Kool-Aid this morning.
we didn't realize with the background is it's centered up in my wall, but then when I'm in videos, it's off center. Oh well.
It's all good. You look fantastic. The background looks fantastic, and I am excited to talk about all things One Tom Plumber today. So, again, yeah, thanks for coming on. I think the first natural place that we start with a lot of our guests, at least, I think it makes the most sense. Especially, I think you and your family have a pretty cool background and a pretty cool story. If you wouldn't mind, let's talk a little bit about your career background, how you got to where you are today, what were kind of some steps along the way, maybe some roadblocks that you had and what you did to overcome them. But let's talk a little bit about your background. How did Kameron Hensley get to become the CEO and co-founder of One Tom Plumber?
Well, I probably have the shortest resume out of anyone you've interviewed.
Okay.
But I was
Maybe the coolest
with my
resume though.
parents
I
owning
would say
Icon
just
Property Rescue. I
as a side, you're probably one of the coolest stories though, but continue. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. With my parents owning Icon Property Rescue, I grew up in the restoration business. So I've done everything for the most part on the restoration side. Um, then when I was in high school, I got my first vehicle and it was a pickup. I started a landscaping business and realized that I could make way, way more money working for myself than I could for anyone else. And then in 2018, it wasn't something that was planned out, but uh, Rocky, who's my dad, started One Tom Plumber, and he ended up firing his ops manager uh, about a week before I graduated. So um, it just worked out, and he talked me into coming on board and getting it up and going.
That's awesome. That's very, very cool. And yeah, obviously it's kind of been a whirlwind, I'm sure, for you over the years as you've kind of worked on this thing. And like you mentioned, you kind of were thrown in to the fire, for lack of a better term, kind of right off the rip, which I think is a cool way to
Mhm.
kind of dive into things. But I want to talk a little bit about like a family owned business, right? You have this family owned and operated business that you got to be a part of. Um, Talk a little bit about that for me. We have lots of clients and I interview a lot of people that are also a part of like family owned businesses. And I love kind of hearing the dynamic and the story about that. How has it been working, working in a family owned business for you? Um, is that something that you've loved? Is that something you've been passionate about? Do you hope to one day get your kids involved maybe in the family owned business? Talk a little bit about what that's been like.
Gotcha. So I don't know if the terminology got to work in the family business works. I think growing up from
Yes.
the time I was about 8 years old, I had to.
Yep.
Um, my parents don't believe in downtime or playing on video games. So even when I wasn't in school, um, they told me I could either go to school or I could work. So I pretty much lived at our office growing up. So when I was really small, I'd pretty much only clean things. So I'd have to mop the warehouse every day, um, wipe down all of the dehues and blowers. Um, Anytime I see those old Phoenix 200s, I have flashbacks to those days. Um, and then as I got older, maybe 12 or so, I started going out with the guys and doing jobs. And that's what I love to do. Anything to stay busy. And I think it was a really cool experience because unlike most people growing up, it taught me work ethic and it taught me about business. And I got to see the business from inside out and really get to know the business.
I love it. Yeah, I think that's something that I've learned more so than anything else excuse me, from people that are a part of these family owned businesses is, yeah, you learn from a young age how to work hard. And I think,
Mhm.
to your point, I think that's lost a little bit in today's day and age. I don't think that maybe that's taught as often as it should be. And I love that that's just something that's instilled in you from the get go, that, hey, we're going to work hard. Um, this is important to us. This is how we put food on the table. So yeah, there's no, there's not a lot of playing video games. There's not a lot of doing, stuff like that. Like, you're going to come, you're going to go to school, and then you're going to come and work hard and have an after school job. Right. And that's, it's, not maybe to the extent as far as a business goes, but like, my dad was raised that way and I was raised that way. And I think it's something to a testament of that, like, hey, you're going to, you're going to learn these things that maybe you don't necessarily pick up in school, right? I mean, there's parts of school that are hard, and you work hard to get good grades and all of those things, but there's something different about like working in and on a business, especially one that requires a little bit of physical labor, like a restoration company, right? Like, it's not necessarily sitting in an office or a cubicle every day. It's very much out working with customers and building relationships with them, and then also doing demolition and cleaning up stuff that's can be a little gross at times, right? Like, you're doing some hard work, and
Mhm.
I think that's really cool that just from a young age you kind of dove right in. And you know, as we'll talk a little bit more, jumping into the one Tom Plumber stuff, like, you jumped into the being an ops manager, where like you've got the experience, you know how to work the operations. Now you've got to also kind of work on dealing with people and building customer relationships and working, managing team members. Um, do you feel like that was something that you also picked up from the family business as well? Or is that something that you've kind of just had to trial by fire, as far as like just kind of learn how to like be a manager and work with team members? And is that something that you kind of just came naturally to you, or is you've had to kind of build that skill over the years?
Well, it's definitely a skill that I've put a lot of work into in building, but I do think that growing up within the business, getting to know the guys, seeing how the guys think, I had a huge advantage. And back when I was a kid, I used to hate having to work at the business, and all my friends would be watching TV and playing video games. And um, as I've grown up, there's just more and more things happen that make me really appreciate the ability and the gift that it was to be involved in the business as a kid.
Well, and yeah, again, to your point, I think what's cool about the restoration industry in general, but also your story individually. But a lot of managers, I feel like there are industries and businesses where managers are hired that don't necessarily know the industry, or that don't know how to do the
Mhm.
work. And so they're brought in as a manager to just kind of manage people, which is, a skill, and it's something that's important. But I feel like your perspective, you have a unique perspective, and a lot of restoration managers do this as well. I feel like there's a lot of project managers that are very similar to this, that you kind of have to do the work in order to know how to manage people. And I think that it probably helps you be more respected by your technicians and your guys, because you're like, oh yeah, we know Cameron has had to do this stuff, right? We know Cameron knows how to handle mitigation work, and he's had to put on PPE and deal with all that crap, right? Like, you've had to do some of those things. And so I think it almost helps you become a better manager because you have the experience, right? You're not just a manager because you got a piece of paper at a college that says you should be a manager, right?
Yeah, well, I had in a way, I'm kind of in the middle there. So
Yeah, yeah,
I know the restoration business, but when I first started, I knew nothing whatsoever about plumbing. And I agree
yeah,
with you. I think it's almost impossible to manage plumbers until you learn the basics of plumbing.
yeah.
So any downtime I had, if I got up early in the morning as I was driving to work, I watched thousands and thousands of hours worth of YouTube videos on plumbing and just read everything I could, read the code books, and within probably the first 3 to 6 months, I had that really good foundation on plumbing, but I pretty much had no life, and that consumed all of my time.
Well, and again, I think that's to your credit. I think there's and maybe it is really just the home service industry, but I feel like there's others that are probably the same way, that like you can't really be a good manager until you have some knowledge. And there's a lot of businesses out there that are just like hiring people not off the street, but hiring managers maybe off the street, that are like, oh yeah, this person's got a lot of really great management experience, but they don't necessarily know how this stuff works. And I love that. You took the time, you recognized that maybe you didn't have as much, you had the restoration, but not the plumbing. I love that you recognize that within yourself. And you're like, I got to go learn this. If I want to be a manager and actually help these guys be better, I've got to have some knowledge of it. And I think that's great. Um, okay. So we've talked a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to this point. I think obviously the big questions that I wanted to really chat with you about today are like, what is One Tom Plumber? It's something I feel like it's catching the industry, especially the restoration industry, by storm. I feel like a lot of people are talking about. We have clients that mention it all the time that are mentioning, "Hey, we're starting a franchise," or "Hey, I've got a friend that's doing this One Tom thing. Like, what do you guys think of it?" And it's something that I have been really curious and learning a little bit more about. And so I would love to kind of hear from your perspective. You guys have a successful restoration company. It's doing well. It's making you guys money. It's putting food on the table for your family. Why kind of dive into this space, this plumbing space? Why kind of go down this road with regards to starting a plumbing franchise?
Gotcha. So that's the question everyone wants to know. So before I get into that, I need to explain what the business model is.
Yeah.
So One Tom Plumber at the end of the day is a bolt-on plumbing franchise. So what we do is we find very successful restoration owners and we sell them a bolt-on, uh, and that bolt-on is One Tom Plumber. So the history of bolt-on franchises is actually fairly recent. Um, but looking at you, I'm sure you probably don't remember, but there was a time in the 1960s when truck stops were just a truck stop. There was no restaurant attached to it. So a really smart salesman at McDonald's did a lot of traveling, and he noticed that what would happen is people would get off at these truck stops, and they would fill up gas, and then they'd either have to walk or drive somewhere else to get food. Um, as simple as it sounds, putting because people need both, putting them in the same business. That's something that it's only about a 60-year-old concept. So what he didn't realize was going to happen is they were thinking there's enough people getting gas. If everyone that gets gas also gets food, we're going to have a super successful McDonald's location here. But what he didn't realize is that people saw the golden arches and they got off to get McDonald's. And while they were there, they were also going to get gas.
Yeah.
But what he didn't realize as well is that people would get off because there were other gas stations there and maybe they were loyal to those. And then they saw, oh, there's a McDonald's and a Love's in the same building. Instead of going to Wendy's and then going to this gas station, I'm actually going to go to these. So those are the huge three advantages to bolting it on. So what we realized is that with a One Tom Plumber, it's the exact same thing. So One Tom Plumber at the end of the day is an emergency service plumbing company. So anytime there's a plumbing emergency, there's almost always a water damage. And
Yeah.
almost every time there's a water damage, there's almost always a plumbing emergency. So what it does, it allows these restoration companies to drastically increase their sales funnel. Especially with the commercial work. So the on the residential side, if a restoration company is doing a lot of TPA work, they can instantly bolt on a One Tom Plumber. That One Tom Plumber is going to get a lot of business just from all the homes which their restoration company is going to. As the One Tom Plumber grows, it's going to bring in business, referring the restoration company. But the primary reason is that third reason, which I was talking about, and that is the commercial water damage. So property managers, just like everyone else, want one-stop shopping, and it is incredibly easy sale to those commercial property managers.
I love that you took or that you came up, and you probably didn't come up with this idea from doing research on this. I'm sure it just kind of came naturally, but I love the analogy of the gas station and the McDonald's, because I think that's a perfect analogy for what you're talking about, that there's there's different scenarios where people are going to want to get those two things. They're going to want to get food and they're going to want to get gas. And there are
Mhm.
probably a handful of different scenarios, to your point, with regards to water damage and plumbing, where they need some plumbing, they need a plumbing fix, and they're also going to need some water damage help, or they're going to need, they got a plumbing issue, and because of that, it caused a water damage incident. And so I think that analogy is perfect, and I'm a very visual person, and so I love that just totally makes sense with regards to why those things are connected. Go ahead.
And how the whole idea came about is um, I was just talking to my parents because we learned about the history of bolt-ons and synergies within businesses and how sometimes it makes more sense to have two businesses together than two businesses separate. But my parents owned the 1-800 Packouts franchise, which is a bolt-on, and a board up franchise as well. But the issue with both um, and why they don't work nearly as well is because the board up franchise in itself does a great job generating leads, but it's not profitable. And the pack out franchise does a great job making money, but it doesn't generate any leads. So I feel like that's why one Tom Plumber is in the perfect sweet spot.
Yeah, and again, I think, yeah, if all it did was provide some leads, it'd be amazing. But it also is providing, like, there's revenue generated, I'm sure, just from the plumbing, right? Like there's other
Mhm.
things that are coming from just that I think are super, super helpful.
The Success Elevated podcast is brought to you by SOS Navigator. SOS Navigator is an on-demand training platform geared towards marketing, personal development, and business growth. We understand that as a business owner in the service industry, you wear a million hats. Let SOS Navigator be a simple and cost-effective way for you to continue to grow your business. Click the link in the show notes below and use code SOS Podcast to get 10% off your next on-demand training course.
So you kind of come up with this idea of, how One Tom Plumber should be, why it would be important, why it would be crucial to bring in leads and help, kind of grow the restoration side of things. Did you get to a point where, I guess probably the initial conversation, was it just about creating a plumbing company for you guys and for Icon? How did this eventually turn into like a franchise opportunity, or was it always going to be a franchising opportunity from the beginning?
No, so when we first started, we just wanted to really perfect what we were doing and bring in lots of leads to Icon. But what we didn't realize is just how successful it would be.
Right.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe we doubled the amount of water damage they got our very first year in business.
Wow.
So we really knew we had something.
That's well, and again, I think if it's successful for you, why wouldn't it be successful for others, right? Like I think, to your point, again, going back to the analogy, but the analogy makes sense and should work regardless of where you're at in the country. There's McDonald's and gas stations regardless of where you are in the country, right? And so I think the plumbing and water damage concept makes sense no matter where you're at. And I think that whole idea just totally works. Did you have initially, when you were like, okay, let's start looking at some opportunities to maybe expand a little bit and coordinate with some other restoration companies and start franchising this idea, were there kind of some initial roadblocks that you faced, and if so, I'm sure there were some. What were those roadblocks, and what was challenging about trying to grow this franchise opportunity?
So there's a lot of difficulties with
Yeah.
franchising. The thing is, none of us knew anything about franchising, so we had to learn how to run a business, because just because we can run a very successful plumbing business doesn't mean we can run a very successful franchise. So just learning that from the ground up. The franchising business model is very, very heavily regulated by the FTC. So we have to get audited every year, which is brutal. And we also have just a lot of paperwork that we have to do. But the one advantage we had is that we never struggled to sell franchises. So most franchisors who I talk to, by far their biggest difficulty is selling franchises. Where for us, our very first trade show, I went to just test the market and see if there was any interest. And just by talking to people without trying whatsoever, I sold our very first 2 locations.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Do you, what does a sales pitch, and we don't necessarily have to go into the nuts and bolts of it, but what is your sales pitch when it comes to like One Tom Plumber? Is it similar to that analogy that you gave me? I'm sure that's probably used in conversation, but how do you have conversations with restoration companies about it? Is it just explaining like how many times have you been called and asked, do you have a plumber you could recommend? Right? Like I listen to calls like that all the time. So what's that conversation like with those restoration companies?
So an advantage for us is almost anyone that talks to us, we don't have to hit them with the sales pitch
Yeah.
because they've already thought about, man, my guys wait on plumbers all the time, or man, these plumber referrals are so absurdly expensive. So by the time they hear there's another option, typically they've reached out to some of our franchisees. We get almost all of our business from word of mouth at this point, just because restoration guys love networking and listening to podcasts and educating themselves. And as they're networking, our franchisees just tell them how successful they've been with One Tom Plumber and how many leads they've gotten. So as long as we continue to do a great job making our franchisees happy, we really don't have to pitch anyone.
That's amazing. Do you think, have you noticed as you've grown and as you've expanded over the years and brought on new franchise companies and a lot of them, like you're saying, you don't necessarily have to give the sales pitch. They know this is something that's going to help their business. Have there been any of the typical like franchise challenges? Like we work and speak with a lot of like franchise organizations that there are pros and cons to just about every franchise model, right? Where a lot of pros, we've got a great network. We get a lot of resources from corporate and they provide us a lot of information that helps us grow our business. Maybe some of the cons are you don't quite have the flexibility that you would like, right? Or that's an example of a potential con. Has there been any pushback, or have you noticed anything that like, what do you feel like separates you guys as a franchise that maybe kind of limits some of those cons of a franchise organization?
So that's a tough question. So we have had people that have started their own plumbing business and bolted it onto the restoration company outside of a franchise and been highly successful, and then have converted into a One Tom Plumber. So the big thing we do is it's still incredibly difficult to start a successful plumbing business, but we make it way easier on our franchisees. So those 3 people who I'm talking about were dedicating 60 to 80 hours a week running their plumbing business, and there was just no way they could run their restoration business as well. So what we've done is we just make it to where they can have an ops manager, and that ops manager is going to work, the 60, 80 hours a week. We've got all checklists and systems, and then they will still have to clock in and manage their ops manager and work with them with those systems. But instead of, 60 to 80 hours a week, it's maybe 20 at the start. And then once it gets up and going, it's substantially less.
It's amazing. Yeah. Cause again, like so many of these restoration companies are owner operators, right? So many of the people that we're talking to on a day-to-day basis are, they would ideally like to be able to just manage the team and just kind of let the team run itself. But in a lot of cases, they're owner operators. And so bolting on, it's a great idea. It's more leads, it's more revenue, but at the end of the day, it's more hours off their schedule. And so, yeah, finding a way to minimize that. And I love that there's a system for that. And you guys have really developed that. And I think that can limit a lot of the headaches and and potentially a lot of the pushback, because, they don't have to, they're not necessarily starting a whole brand new franchise they're not opening up a second location or convincing their team that, hey, we need to start a second business while we're doing this business, right? Like it makes it a lot more simple and straightforward, which I love. And I think that's going to resonate with a lot of, the people that I talk to. So that's super cool.
Absolutely. And actually, the more I think about it, obviously saving them a lot of time gives them a lot of value. Saving them money is valuable as well. But I think the main reason why people join a One Tom Plumber, it's hard to describe the culture within our business. So between our owners, there is like anyone they call will always pick up the phone. Um, there's a sense of brotherhood that is undescribable. And I'll give you an example, and this almost seems exaggerated, but there's 35 of our either people here at HQ or our franchisees have one Tom Plummer tattoos. And that just shows you how passionate people are about the brand.
That's
Um,
amazing.
that I've never heard of another brand where people are so excited and passionate where they go out and get the company logo tattooed on their body.
That's amazing. Is it pink as well? It's got to have the pink, right?
So they about half are just a black outline,
Gotcha.
and then half do have the pink as well.
The color in there as well. Oh, I love it. And I love that you've built such great brand recognition that people see the pink and they're like, oh yeah, there goes One Tom. Or they go to a trade show and they see a pink banner coming around a corner and they don't even have to know what it says on the other side. They know it's One Tom Plummer. And I love it. I love it. I think that's how you build great brand recognition, which is just so cool. And now you've got some quote unquote free advertising from the tattoos. I think that's such a cool thing, right? That's awesome. Um, well, I think the kind of the natural place here, Cameron, is, you know, the natural question that I have to ask is, what's the future look like? We're at the start of 2024, so you can break it down in with regards to just maybe some yearly goals or whatever. But what does the future look like for One Tom Plummer? Or do you have some new features or new systems for your franchisees? Or maybe you've got some goals for just the amount of franchisees you'd like to bring on? What's the future look like for you guys?
So for us, we just entered our third year. So we're very new into franchising. We're a very new, very quick moving business. Um, so I guess to answer your question with goals, so um, I have 28 goals for the year, which
Wow.
I the first thing I do when I get into the office is I read all the goals out loud. I review my daily plan and I make sure that there's an action to accomplish every goal every day. And it's also the last thing I do before I leave when I make my plan for tomorrow. But the big ones are, of course, the revenue. Um, so we did a little over 30 million last year in our second year. Um, the first goal is to get to 60 million within the calendar year, but I truly believe that we're probably going to triple. We could lose a lot of momentum and still probably get close to 90 million. Um, and then we're at 65 franchises right now. I'd like to see us at least at 120 by the end of the year.
It's amazing. So you're looking to basically double the amount of franchise locations. You've got some great revenue goals. I love it. And I think that's just a lesson in goal setting more so than anything else, right? Like, it's great to talk about One Tom, but I love that you have those goals laid out. I love that you go into your office and read them. We've had several great podcasts recently that have talked about goals and making plans for the new year. And I love that, you know, maybe you don't have to do something like a vision board, but you just have your goals laid out and you read them and you talk about them. And it's something that it's not like back of your mind that, you know, it's not buried on a sticky note somewhere. Like, you are aware of them. You're considering them all the time. They help you make decisions. That's how goals are accomplished, not by writing everything down and then throwing that note somewhere and hoping you remember them, right? Like, that's how those goals get accomplished. So I
Absolutely.
commend you for that.
But
That's awesome.
thank you. Well, I do have a vision board too, and it's in
Well,
my
perfect.
office.
Even better. Even better.
It's like 2 feet by 4 feet, and
Yeah.
it's right by my door, so I see it. Um, and I love people come into my office all the time, like our franchisees, and they're like, "All right, how are you doing with your goals? Like, are you on track for all of them?" And I've got, you know, I can't ever let my goals get off track. So if at any point I'm not on pace to hit my goal, it doesn't go well.
Oh, it's amazing. Well, and you've established that kind of culture so people can follow up with you. People can be like, "Hey, how are these going, man?" They're not weirded
Mhm.
out by it. They're not like, "Oh, why is this guy doing a vision board? Why has he got so many goals?"
Mhm.
You've kind of built this culture where it's like, "Okay, what's going on? Let's follow up. Let's see how these things are going." So I love it, man. I think that's amazing. Um, Cameron, thank you so much for coming on today. This was a great conversation. I want to wrap up. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I want to wrap up by asking the 3 questions we ask all of our guests. It kind of is a great way to unify all of our podcasts and help people kind of see some different comparisons of how people get through their days. But first question, do you have a book or podcast that you've read recently or listened to recently that you just really love?
Yeah, so I just finished Invent and Wonder. It's a biography on Jeff Bezos. So anytime I can
Very
get in
cool.
someone's head that's that successful, that is that good at systems, it's very, yeah, it's super educational. Um, I'm struggling through Never Split the Difference right now.
Yeah.
I'm a little over halfway through. The quality of the content is amazing, but it may be the most boring book I've ever read. And I've read a lot of incredibly boring books. And then I'm about to start Made in America by Sam Walton.
Oh, it's amazing. I love it. Those are I haven't heard the Sam Walton recommendation, but I've heard the other two. And both of those, yeah, that Never Split the Difference is a tough read, but it's super important. It's got some great information. And then yeah, Jeff Bezos biography I've heard is really awesome. So both great recommendations. Um, Second question. I know you wear a lot of hats. Obviously, you've got a lot on your plate and you're working with a lot of franchisees and you're trying to help them, and you're both trying to help the franchisees grow while also helping just one Tom Plumber as an organization grow as well. Um, how do you relax at the end of a long day? How do you recharge the mental and emotional batteries?
Um, so I'm probably not a good person to ask that question if you're looking for advice on how to relax. Um, every once in a while I'll watch TV with my wife, but um, at the end of my day, I always create a plan for the next day. I'm horrifically ADHD, so I pretty much always have to be doing something. So the closest I get to relaxation is typically meditation at the end of a long day, but uh, I pretty much just go until I collapse from exhaustion, normally about 10 o'clock, and do it again the next day.
Do it again the next day. No, that's great. The meditation thing I think is important. The planning thing I think is helpful more so than you think. For me, and I do this at the end of the workday, so there's obviously more hours in the day, but at the end of my workday, I typically will write down some things that I know, oh, I wasn't able to get to these things today, or maybe kind of structure out a plan of how I'm going to get to those things tomorrow. And for me, that's super helpful because if I don't create a plan, it like wears on me and it stresses me out and be like, oh, how am I going to get all these things done tomorrow? But that plan can be good for my brain to just be like, okay, I know how I'm going to get these things done tomorrow. I talk to this person. I'm going to call this thing. I'm going to create this document, whatever, right? Like I'm going to do all of those things and they're going to get accomplished. And so, yeah, creating the plan, I think is more helpful than you think. So I love that recommendation.
Oh, absolutely. That's what helps me sleep at night. If I
Yeah.
don't have a
Yeah.
plan for the next day, I'll be laying in bed like, oh, I need to do this tomorrow. I need to do this.
Yep.
Or once I've created that plan, I can sleep like a baby.
Love it. Love it. Last question. Again, Cameron, this has been awesome. Awesome having you on. If you could rewind to the beginning of your career, and you can take this kind of however you want, if it's just the beginning of One Tom Plumber, or if it's the beginning of you working with your parents at Icon, whatever kind of direction you want to take with this. But if you could rewind to the beginning of your career and tell younger Cameron one thing, what would that one thing be?
So for me, that would be not to fail or fear failure. So yeah, just don't fear failure at all. So all you could do is your best. Uh, and if it doesn't work, learn from it and try again. I used to be so worried that I would fail. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and work some more. And um, yeah, I think that would be the best piece of advice for young Cameron.
Love it. That's that's a very similar recommendation, and which I think is cool. I think I love that so many successful people that I get to talk to, and I get to talk to some really cool people like yourself, and I love that so many of them mention something similar, where it's like, don't worry, like everything's going to work out, or don't be afraid to fail, like take chances, like everything's going to be okay. And I love that even the most successful people that I've talked to and that I work with still feel that. They're like, hey, like, don't beat yourself up. Like, it's okay to fail. Like, don't be afraid. Like, you're going to learn from your mistakes. And I think that's crucial for young people and for old people and for everybody in between to, like, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Mistakes are what help you learn and be better. And that's awesome. I love it. Kameron, again, thank you so much for coming on today. It was an awesome podcast. I know our guests, or our listeners, excuse me, are going to get a lot of value. They always do from our guests, and you're no exception. So really appreciate your insight. Love everything that you mentioned. If we have some audience members or some listeners that are interested in learning a little bit more about One Tom Plumber, where can they find out a little bit more about you guys?
So if they want to just learn about the business, that's at onetomplumber.com. And if they're interested in a franchise opportunity, that's 1tpfranchise.com.
Perfect. That's a great little spiel at the end. We'll make sure those are both linked in the description for your episode. Again, Kameron, thank you so much. And we'll talk to you again in the future.
I really appreciate it, Hayden.
This has been Success Elevated, making you a little bit better one show at a time. Thanks for joining us. Please subscribe on YouTube or any other major podcast platform to listen to more episodes. We are proudly brought to you by Spot On Solutions. If you'd like to learn more about how we can help you grow your business, please check us out at spotonsolutions.com.